controlling the human mind. There is a sentence that sounds like it belongs in the worst corner of the internet, but it is real. During the Cold War, the CIA seriously investigated whether the human mind could be controlled, not influenced, not persuaded, controlled. They looked at drugs, hypnosis, isolation, sensory deprivation, psychological pressure, interrogation techniques, memory, fear, panic, obedience, and eventually, even stranger things, remote viewing, altered states of consciousness, and the possibility that the mind could somehow reach beyond the body. On paper, it sounds ridiculous. SD, mind control, psychic spies, out-of-body intelligence gathering. It sounds like the plot of a bad film made by someone who had never met a real spy. But that is the disturbing part. These were not jokes. They were not written by people doing a bit. They were written inside powerful institutions during one of the most paranoid periods in modern history, by people who believed that if America did not discover the secrets of the mind first, its enemies would. And that is where this story begins. Not with a mad scientist cackling in a basement, not with a villain stroking a cat, but with fear. The Cold War did not just create bigger bombs, it created bigger fears. And fear gave intelligence agencies permission to imagine almost anything. This is the world of declassified files. The world where official government documents can read like horror, dark comedy, and science fiction all at once. It is the world of project names like MKULTRA, BLUEBIRD, ARTICHOKE, Gateway, and Stargate. Names that sound absurd until you remember what they were attached to. Human beings, patients, prisoners, soldiers, addicts, sex workers, civilians, some volunteers, some people who had absolutely no idea they were inside an experiment. This is not a story about the CIA secretly having magic powers. That would almost be easier. This is a story about something more disturbing. The CIA was afraid its enemies might have powers it did not understand, so it started testing the impossible on real people. And once that door opened, it became very hard to close. In the early 1950s, America was staring at the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, nuclear weapons, communist expansion, defectors, double agents, and captured American prisoners from the Korean War. The fear inside Washington was not just that enemies could kill American soldiers. It was that enemies could break them. What if the Soviets had discovered a way to brainwash people? What if Chinese interrogators could make prisoners confess to things they had not done? What if communist agents could turn Americans against their own country? What if the next battlefield was not land, sea, or air, but memory, identity, and belief? To understand MKUltra, you have to understand that atmosphere. Because the strange thing about paranoia is that once it gets into a government, it starts to sound like strategy. If the enemy might be brainwashing people, then America needed to understand brainwashing. If the enemy might be using drugs, then America needed drugs. If the enemy might be using hypnosis, then America needed hypnosis. If the enemy might be able to break a mind, then America had to learn how minds break. And in 1953, the CIA formally authorized Project MKUltra. At the center of this world was Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was a chemist, a senior CIA figure connected to the technical services side of the agency. And over time, he became one of the names most closely associated with America's search for mind control. He does not enter this story as a spy in a tuxedo. He enters it as something stranger, a government scientist with access to secrecy, money, laboratories, and a Cold War excuse for almost anything. The early questions were framed as intelligence problems. Could a drug make someone talk? Could a chemical make a prisoner easier to interrogate? Could a person be made confused, suggestible, obedient, forgetful? Could you erase memory? Could you create panic? Could you make someone act against their will? Could you build the perfect truth serum? And the drug that became almost mythic inside this program was LSD. Today, LSD is associated with counterculture, music festivals, psychedelic therapy debates, and the 1960s. But before that, inside intelligence circles, it looked like a weapon. It was powerful. It was unpredictable. It could completely alter perception. And if you are an intelligence agency obsessed with interrogation and control, unpredictable does not always mean useless. It means interesting. So the experiments began. At first, it is tempting to imagine this as something limited. A small CIA lab, a few people in white coats, some controlled tests. But MKUltra was not one experiment. It was a web. Money moved through front organizations. Research was contracted out. Universities, hospitals, prisons, medical facilities, private foundations, and pharmaceutical companies became part of a system where the source of the funding was not always clear. Some researchers knew they were working for the CIA. Some appear not to have known. Some subjects volunteered for research. Others did not even know they had been given a drug. And this is where the story starts to darken. Because once you decide that the mind is a battlefield, the person attached to that mind can become secondary. The file no longer says patient. It says subject. It no longer says human being. It says response, dose, observe, record, repeat. CIA employees were dosed. Military personnel were dosed. Prisoners were used. Psychiatric patients were used. People on the edges of society were used because they were easier to ignore. And then there was one of the most grotesque chapters in the entire history of the program. Operation Midnight Climax. Even the name sounds fake. It sounds like a rejected Austin Powers joke, but the reality was not funny. CIA-linked safe houses operated in places like San Francisco and New York. Men were allegedly lured there by prostitutes connected to the operation. Once inside, some were secretly given LSD or other substances, while observers watched from behind one-way glass. The stated goal was to study behavior in a more realistic setting. That is the language bureaucracy uses when it wants something ugly to sound clinical. A realistic setting. What it meant was this. People were being drugged without consent, manipulated, watched, and turned into data. And this is the pattern that keeps repeating in the MKUltra story. The documents often sound absurd. The consequences are not. A spy agency looking for mind control sounds like dark comedy until you picture the room. The drink, the drug, the person who does not know what is happening to them. The fear as reality starts to bend. The people watching, taking notes, telling themselves it was necessary. Then the story moves north to Canada, to the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, connected to McGill University, where psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron carried out extreme psychiatric experiments that later became one of the most haunting chapters linked to MKUltra. This was not a hidden bunker. It was not an underground lair. It was a respected medical institution. People came there for help. Some were dealing with depression, anxiety, postnatal struggles, ordinary human suffering. And inside that world, Cameron experimented with methods that included heavy drug use, intensive electroshock, long periods of induced sleep, and something called psychic driving, repeated messages played to patients over and over again. The idea was that a person could be broken down and rebuilt, de-patterned, reprogrammed. That word is important because it tells you how far the thinking had gone. This was not only about extracting information anymore. It was about whether identity itself could be taken apart. Imagine going to a hospital because you need care, and instead becoming part of a secret history you never agreed to enter. That is the horror of MKUltra, not just the drugs, not just the experiments, the betrayal. The people inside these programs were often not enemy agents. They were not Soviet masterminds. They were not hardened spies carrying secret codes. They were vulnerable people, and the institution that should have protected them became part of the machine using them. The great irony is that after all of this, the program did not produce a reliable mind control weapon. LSD did not create obedient agents. Hypnosis did not unlock a perfect method of control. Human behavior turned out to be too complex, too unpredictable, too human. Instead of producing a clean intelligence tool, MKUltra produced trauma, scandal, lawsuits, missing records, damaged families, and a permanent stain on the reputation of American intelligence. Every failure should have stopped the project. Instead, each failure seemed to open a stranger door. Because even when the chemical dream of mind control began to collapse, the intelligence interest in the mind did not disappear. It mutated. If drugs could not reliably unlock the mind, what about altered states? What about meditation? What about remote perception? What about psychic ability? What if, instead of controlling someone else's mind, you could use your own mind to gather intelligence from a distance? That is how we get to the later world of remote viewing, the gateway process, and Stargate. Now, this is where the internet often loses its mind. The gateway document gets passed around as if it proves the CIA discovered astral projection, cracked the universe, or found a military shortcut to another dimension. That is not what proves. What it actually shows is stranger in a more bureaucratic way. 1983 An army-linked analysis examines something called the gateway process, a program associated with altered states of consciousness, meditation, brainwave synchronization, and out-of-body experiences. The report is real. The fact that people in government looked at this is real. But looking at something is not the same as proving it works. That distinction matters. Because the real story is not that the CIA had psychic super soldiers floating around the Soviet Union. The real story is that after decades of fear, intelligence agencies were willing to investigate almost any possibility if they thought it might provide an advantage. And that leads into Stargate, the remote viewing program. Remote viewing was the idea that a person might be able to describe a hidden or distant target using only the mind. A building they had never visited. A location they could not see. A secret site on the other side of the world. Again, it sounds ridiculous. But during the Cold War, ridiculous was not always enough to kill a project. The logic was brutally simple. What if the Soviets are doing it? What if they are ahead? What if there is a 1% chance this works? Can we afford not to try? That question, can we afford not to try, is one of the most dangerous questions in intelligence history, because once you ask it enough times, almost anything becomes reasonable. By the mid-1990s, the remote viewing era reached its own dead end. A CIA commission review concluded that remote viewing had not produced useful, actionable intelligence. The program was terminated and declassified. So the psychic spy story ended much like the chemical mind control story. A huge idea, a deep fear, years of experimentation, and in the end, no reliable weapon. But the lack of success does not make the story harmless. A failed unethical experiment is still unethical. A failed abuse of power is still abuse. And the clearest human turning point in this entire story has a name. Frank Olson. Olson was a US Army scientist connected to biological weapons research at Fort Detrick. In 1953, during a CIA-linked retreat, Olson was given LSD without his knowledge. Days later, he was in New York. And then he fell from a hotel window. The official version described his death as suicide. But over the years, the circumstances have remained disputed, questioned by his family, investigated, re-examined, and surrounded by suspicion. For this episode, the most important thing is not to pretend we can solve every mystery around his death. The important thing is what his story represents. This is where MKUltra stops being an abstract story about weird CIA ideas. This is where it becomes a story about consequences. A man was secretly drugged by people connected to the government he served. Then he died. And for years, his family did not know the full truth of what had happened before that fall. That is the moment the story changes. Because after Frank Olson, you cannot hide behind words like research. You cannot hide behind Cold War necessity. You cannot hide behind national security. At some point, the question becomes very simple. Who gave them the right? Who gave an intelligence agency permission to secretly experiment on human beings? Who decided that consent was optional? Who decided that fear of the enemy mattered more than the rights of the person in the room? And then, as if the story was not already dark enough, comes the archive mystery. 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered MKUltra records destroyed. That single decision shaped everything we know and everything we will never know. Because once the files were shredded, burned, or removed, the full map of the program became impossible to reconstruct. Names vanished. Details vanished. The paper trail was broken. The most important document in the MKUltra archive may be the one that no longer exists. That is why this story belongs in the Omitted Ledger. Because the ledger is not just what is written down. It is also what was erased. In the 1970s, the story finally began to break into public view. The Church Committee, the Rockefeller Commission, Senate hearings, Freedom of Information requests, investigators asking what had been done, who had authorized it, and how far it had gone. Then came one of the strangest twists in the entire archive. Some MKUltra documents survived, not because someone heroically saved them, but because they had been stored separately in financial records, away from the files targeted for destruction. The truth survived partly because of bureaucracy. 7 boxes of financial paperwork, fragments, payments, approvals, sub-projects. Not the full story, but enough to prove the story was real. Enough to show that MKUltra was not a single mad scientist experiment. It was a network, a system, a culture, a world of front organizations, hidden funding, researchers, safe houses, hospitals, prisons, and officials who believed the normal rules could be suspended because the Cold War was too important. And that is the real danger of this story. It is not simply that a few people made terrible choices. It is that secrecy protected those choices. Fear justified them. Science dressed them up, and bureaucracy made them look normal. The aftermath was not neat justice. Some survivors sued. Some families searched for answers. Some officials said they could not remember. Some documents were released. Many were gone forever. And because so much was destroyed, MKUltra will always sit in that uncomfortable space between history and absence. We know enough to be horrified. We do not know enough to be finished. That is what makes it linger. The scandal did not end because the truth came out. It ended because enough truth came out to prove how much was missing. And maybe that is the final lesson. MKUltra is not really a story about LSD. It is not really a story about hypnosis. It is not even really a story about mind control. It is a story about what happens when a government convinces itself that morality is a luxury it cannot afford. Because that is the mindset underneath all of this. The enemy is dangerous. The threat is existential. The future of the country is at stake. So we have to do things we would normally never do. We have to cross lines. We have to keep secrets. We have to experiment. We have to know. And once that logic takes over, almost anything can be excused. The horror of MKUltra is not that the CIA successfully controlled the human mind. The horror is that, for a time, no one seemed able to control the CIA. And that leaves us with the question at the center of the Omitted Ledger. If these are the ideas that survived the shredder, what else is still missing from the record? Because as insane as the search for mind control was, it was only one chapter. Next time, we move from the terrifying to the ridiculous. Exploding cigars, humiliation plots, giant condoms, and the CIA's strangest attempts to weaponize embarrassment.